High school is a breeding ground for loathing, acne, and peer pressure, and that's on the good days. For me, school is more about dodging bullies than red rubber balls. I slid through the crowded hallways, my head down, trying to avoid being noticed. "Hey, Ward, where you going, slag?" followed me down the hall. I guess all of mining around town made slag an insult. Heads turn, some to watch, some to leave as fast as possible. When you have a collar, you don't want to be a handy target. You wouldn't think having a silver band no thicker than your finger affixed around your neck would cause so many issues, but it did. After a short argument between my male pride and my instinct for self-preservation, I ran, hoping none of the pretty girls saw. I hitched up my backpack, rounded the corner, and headed for the cafeteria. Depending on the teacher, I might get some assistance. Bruner closed the gap as I ran into the cafeteria. Rows of beige tables stood as mute witness to my pending humiliation. Most of the tables sat empty, but the few students around decided to help. Technically, they helped Bruner by blocking my exit, but I'm not complaining much. Great job, Tommy. Run into a room with no teachers. At least once a week we played this game, so I set my backpack on the floor, no sense getting blood on it. "Mutt, I asked you a question," Bruner, a goon in every sense of the word, cracked his knuckles, the sound preceding him as he approached. At any other school, he would have been a star football player. Being 6'2" and over 250, I would call him a Neanderthal, but why insult our ancestors who discovered fire? I doubted those innovative cavemen would be 19 and still juniors in high school. His fist smashed into my mouth, dropping me to the floor. I hate to be ignored. "Who could ignore something as ugly as you?" I tried to say, but a size 14 Timberland boot stopped anything from coming out of my mouth that wasn't breakfast. "Stay down," Bruner yelled as he kicked me in the side again. Pain exploded through me, and I felt like I would burst, absorbing the punishment. I pulled my knees up, struggling to protect myself better. The crowd, drawn to the scent of blood, encircled us, chanting "slag" as Bruner continued his onslaught. I struggled up to my hands and knees. Standing would take a lot more effort. I'd be damned if I'd let him think he had the best of me. I had a reputation to maintain, however pitiful. I can only take... If only I didn't have this damn collar, even a crappy power like Firework Farley would have lit him up. I tensed as his foot swung back to deal the final blow. Break it up, Mr. Taylor shouted as he bowled his way through the crowd of students encircling us. The bell was about to ring. Get to class. The kick never landed as Mr. Taylor grabbed Bruner by the shirt collar. This time, you aren't getting away with it. "Mr. Taylor," Bruner pulled out of his grip, pulling up his hands to protest his innocence. "Tommy fell. I tried to help him up." "I was born on a Wednesday, but it wasn't last Wednesday. You'll be getting a week of detention and a phone call to your parents." "I don't think that will be necessary, Mr. Taylor," Vice Principal Robinson said from behind him. Robinson was immaculately dressed in her usual business suit and heels, of which I had a great view. Her blue-black skin made her look almost statuesque, but the flash of anger in her eyes argued otherwise. Obviously, Mr. Ward tripped, and Mr. Bruner lent a helping hand. Dissidents tend to be clumsy, after all. Bruner laughed, his friends rallying around him, high-fiving and slapping him on the back. "You'll get yours, Taylor, you freaking terrorist," Bruner taunted. His friends all laughed as they sauntered out of the cafeteria. Taylor bent over to help me up. "I will not stand for a student being beaten just for what he is." I groaned as the conversation veered into oncoming traffic and a head-on collision with a semi. Vice Principal Robinson stepped closer. "Mr. Taylor, I understand your point. The government has worked hard to mainstream dissidents back into society, but troublemakers tend to end up in the block, and I would hate to lose one of my best teachers." Mr. Taylor straightened, his face draining of all color. The block, one of the maximum security detention facilities, quelled even the toughest gifted. Taylor knew she didn't make idle threats. "As you wish, I will take Mr. Ward to the nurse so she can check him for injuries." I jumped up, fighting to regain my balance. The world spun for a second, but I stayed on my feet, a major accomplishment after being worked over by Bruner. I'd gotten better at avoiding serious damage during these incidents. Mom would be upset if the nurse called her again. "I'm fine, Mr. Taylor." I grasped his elbow as the world slid sideways, my stomach leaping back to the back of my throat. "See, Mr. Taylor, the boy isn't hurt. Please escort Mr. Ward to class and remind him not to be so clumsy in the future. A week's detention should help him think about what he's done. He shouldn't need an escort to protect him going to class. Mr. Taylor, it's fine. I really do need to be more careful walking to class." I stared into his eyes, trying to convince him to drop it. The last thing I wanted was for him to end up in the block on account of me. Once the gifted entered, they never came out again. I couldn't let that happen to him. "See, the boy understands the situation better than most, Mr. Taylor." She turned on her stiletto heels and strode across the cafeteria. I waited until Vice Principal got out of earshot. I slung my backpack over my shoulder. "Thanks, Mr. Taylor." "It's not right, Tommy. You can't help being born with gifts any more than she could help being born black." We passed through the cafeteria doors, then my mouth flew to where my brain feared to tread. "Did you have your powers before the reclamation?" It was considered rude and a bit dangerous to ask about Gifted's powers, but I didn't have anyone else to ask. All the kids my age had been collared in kindergarten, so we didn't even know what our abilities could do. Mr. Taylor studied me for a bit before answering. "Yes, I did, Tommy." I trembled with excitement. An actual gifted who knew what they could do was similar to meeting a rock star. It must have been amazing, I blurted out. "Amazing, but there are costs for using your gifts. Still, my life ended the day they collared me, but it also saved me. Gifts are always a two-edged sword." He stared into the distance for a moment before glancing over my shoulder. The first bell rang before I could ask more. Vice Principal Robinson watched us from the school office's entrance, her long, gleaming red fingernails tapping on the door frame. Mr. Taylor cleared his throat. "If you aren't careful, they'll cut you to ribbons." "Gotta go. Thanks, Mr. Taylor." I shoved my arms through my backpack straps and ran for history class, my least favorite subject. Thank you. So that's the first part of the book. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Okay.
So will we find out more about the metal collars later?
Yes. So, and the gifted are in collars. They can't use their powers because they've been outlawed after a terrorist attack. So it's a little bit of it's more of a dystopian superhero than maybe your standard Marvel fare.
Definitely.
Do we find out how the collars work?
It somewhat. It gets
or is it part of the mystical setup?
It stops them from using their powers, but as it goes on, you find out more things about what's going on behind the scenes.
I think you're asking whether it's science fiction or science fantasy.
Yeah, sort of.
Probably a little more science fantasy. It doesn't. I don't get into the actual mechanics of how they work, but there are some interesting facets that come out later in the story.
Anything else to read?
No, I can read a little more from this.
Yeah, why don't you read a little bit more?
Okay, I'll just continue the chapter.
They gave you up to an hour, it looks like.
Yep, they did. I slid through the doorway right before Mr. Powell shut the door. Of all the teachers I had to deal with, Lewis C. Powell was the worst. Ex-military and the Reclaimer's chosen representative in Redemption, Powell bore the scars of hunting down Gifted during the Reclamation War. He hated Gifted with every ounce of his being and made sure we knew it. "Why, class? Look, Mr. Ward, our resident terrorist, decided to grace us with his presence," his angry sneer twisting the scars. "You know, these dissidents think they can come and go as they please. Well, at least they used to before we collared them like the mutts they are." The class laughed. They always laughed. "And here it comes, wait for it. Let's see what Mr. Ward thinks of a week's detention for being late." The second bell rang announcing class should start. I'd made it on time, but Powell's petty cruelties brought him great joy and the norms worshipped him, the reclamation hero. 2 weeks of detention before first period. Another record for the book set by Mr. Tommy Ward, juvenile delinquent. Mr. Powell stomped to the front of the room, his self-satisfied smirk firmly affixed to his scarred face. Today we are discussing the after effects of the reclamation. Can anyone tell me why we are so fortunate to have students like Mr. Ward here? A couple of hands shot up around the room, but none higher than Wendell Hempstead's. The school nerd, he would have been bully feed if not for the gifted. Powell's daily assault reinforced the fact that the gifted were at the bottom of the food chain. Okay, Mr. Hempstead. He stood to answer. Wendell's bad haircut, pasty white skin, and Coke bottle glasses showed him to be the ultimate kiss-ass. Mr. Powell, after the destruction of the major cities of the world by the dissident terrorists, the reclaimers had detention centers built in 5 locations: Siberia, Poland, Brazil, the Sudan, and here. College dissidents are required to live within 200-mile radius of one of these detention centers. Thus, Mr. Ward is here at our school. Very good, Mr. Hempstead. Wendell beamed at the praise as he sat down. He is such a brown-noser. Why are you required to live within 200 miles of such centers, Mr. Ward? Powell said, a nasty gleam in his eyes. So you don't have to be too far from your boyfriend? Popped into my head and may have made it out of my mouth if I'd felt suicidal. While I couldn't be kicked out of school, this being the designated dissident school, worse things could happen and Powell would make sure they did. I decided not to die today, so we can be monitored and have frequent updates to our collars, Mr. Powell, and after re-education become a valued member of a society. I am such a wuss. That is correct. Mr. Powell turned his back and launched into the real lecture on how the Protectorate saved us all from the horrors of the gifted menace, how noble his surrender after all the dissidents had been captured, blah, blah, blah. I failed history every term, but no one cared if I did well or not. Well, other than Mom. She most definitely cared. The rest of the day crawled like a slug across broken glass. Pre-calc ended with a reminder from Ms. Hannah to study for tomorrow's test. I grabbed my backpack and headed to the Dissident Protection Center, built to withstand an uncollared gifted just in case one of us ever broke free. In 15 plus years, the Institute had been educating gifted kids. The detention has been its sole use. I entered what we called the airlock. The room could hold 400 to 500 people, even though there were only about 100 gifted kids going to school here. The door belonged in a high-tech bank, not a high school. Carbonium doors and 6-inch bolts were set into 2 feet of ultra-hard concrete. The walls, floors, and ceilings had been constructed of the same stuff. Rumor had it a nuclear bomb went and damaged the airlock. Inside, a wonderland of beige awaited us. Beige walls complemented the light brown floor tile and the off-white ceiling. The lights were some sort of filament tech, no electricity in the lines just in case. The only real thing in the room was an old wooden desk a gifted teacher sat at during our time here. Most of the kids waited here for the Institute's armored buses to take them to the dorms, but the rest of us, the ones who lived at home, constant detention, had been implemented to keep us on campus for as long as possible. John and Wendy Stevens were already there. Wendy stood out, a rose in a junkyard, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. She could have been prom queen if not for the collar she wore. Her friends clustered around, words flying around like tumbleweed in a windstorm. Wendy's twin, John, stood a head taller than most of the gifted guys he hung out with. He rivaled any quarterback with square jaw and wide shoulders. Not that it mattered. Once the collar had been affixed, the label of dissidents, of slag, applied to everything, and everything changed. I passed by, flashing an awkward half smile at Wendy, who didn't see it. Another gifted girl murdered. I'm scared, one of the girls remarked, wringing her hands in front of her. What if it happens here? John snorted. We are under guard 24 hours a day. No one gets out of here until they're 18. Wendy smacked John's shoulder. As my rude brother pointed out, it would be difficult to attack anyone here. His head swiveled to face her, the purple bruise around John's left eye plainly obvious. Yeah, nobody ever gets attacked here. Tommy got the crap beat out of him by Bruner just this morning. All heads turned to look at me. My face decided a bright red would accent all the bruises developing there. Wendy gave me the puppy dog eyes, as any reasonable 16-year-old boy would do. I fled. I sat down at my desk and took out a book to read. We were supposed to do homework, but none of us ever bothered. Unless your teacher had a collar, you didn't get higher than a C in class anyhow. I felt a hand on my shoulder and jumped a bit. Marcel pushed into the desk next to me, sucking in his stomach to accomplish this feat of contortion. He wasn't fat, exactly. Mom called him big-boned. A huge smile crossed his face as he ran his hair through his afro. Marcel's hair could be considered the eighth wonder of the world, of the modern world, due to his size. "Hey, bruh, what's up?" he asked, extracting a Samsung Supernova from his backpack and popping open an app he had written. "I hacked the guards' frequencies and they're going crazy. Someone broke out of the block." "Really?" No one had broken out of the block before. It made Fort Knox look like a tourist trap. "Yeah, a nasty dude called Grim Reaper. They say he killed 12 guards getting out," Marcel grinned. "Good for him. Bad for us." Whatever problems arose, the reclaimers cracked down on all the gifted. Random searches, lockdowns, and emergency practices would be coming soon. When the first of the gifted women went missing, the norms freaked out. For a gifted to have killed a norm, especially multiple guards, at the world's toughest prison, should be impossible. Marcel punched me lightly in the shoulder. "Yeah, but bruh, he got away." He tapped his chin, which indicated a plan in the works. But there was no way out for us, especially without our gifts. If you tried to escape, they locked you away and put you on TV for Saturday Night Showdown. The norms loved to see us fight in high def. I decided to change the subject before someone overheard us. "Mom sent in the paperwork to renew your weekend pass." He nodded, a smile growing his face. "Excellent. Mom's cooking is a lot better than the Institute's. They served instant potatoes the other night. I mean, who would do that to a poor potato? I guess the Spuds must have been gifted." We laughed. To the rest of the world, we were opposite in every way. He was tall, big, and black, where I was short, skinny, and white, described to me. But in our hearts, we had been brothers since the day we met in kindergarten, and things would never change. The last of the kids filtered in. The guards sealed the door from the outside. The thump of the carbinium bolts slid into place, reverberating in my chest. My stomach twisted, like always, because my stupid lizard brain nibbles at the thought, is this the last time they're going to open the doors again? If everything was normal, in an hour or so we would be released to go home for the night. High school really sucks. That's the end of chapter 1. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about your inspiration for the characters of Tommy and Marcel?
Sure. So the story kind of generated. I was watching my son, Nicholas, was a major Power Rangers fan, and so he would watch it nonstop. And so I was sitting there watching like the 50th episode for the day, and I started thinking, the people of Angels Grove would really just be better off just moving. How long were they going to take these constant daily attacks by the aliens? And so I decided, I was like, well, that would go the same for superheroes, and the idea sort of kind of came about. And I wrote the first novel and then realized that a lot of the way that Tommy and Marcel talk are just like the way my friend Nicholas and his best friend Phoenix talk to each other. And so I kind of went back and modified it a little bit to be a little more like they are, because the part about them being more different, Phoenix is like my size. At 13, he was my size. Huge afro, just great kid. And my son at the time was really short and skinny, and they were, the minute they met, they were best friends, and it's never changed. So I didn't realize until I had finished the book and started reading, I was like, oh, it's actually kind of them. So I kind of messed with it a little bit to make it kind of loosely based off them.
And who's the publisher?
Falstaff Books. They're a small publisher out of Charlotte. So, and I have 2 more books coming out. The second one is in the process of being released. It should be out May, and then the third book should be out early 2020.
All right. Thanks for reading for us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming.